Welcome to the fifth and final lecture of the BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion's fall lecture series. I am David DeCosimo. I'm director of the Institute and associate professor in the School of Theology, and I'm delighted to see each of you. The Institute was founded 50 years ago by a group of philosophers, theologians, and scholars of religion who had been among the teachers of Martin Luther King Jr. And that tradition of philosophical personalism, with its emphasis on taking very seriously and treating with maximal rigor fundamental and basic human questions, is precisely the legacy that the Institute was founded to preserve and to pursue. And this lecture series, over the course of the semester this year, asking and inquiring about the end of the university, is in a very important sense an exemplification of the spirit behind and animating the Institute itself. That is, asking together with distinguished lecturers, talking together with those lecturers about what it is we are even doing here. Why it should be that in a world that is racked with injustice and suffering, in a world where the resources that are used to sustain a university like this, let alone the two across the river, could be directed to any number of material deprivations, why we would gather here, why you would study here, and why we would think that talking together about such questions could even matter or be important, if it can. And it's our final chance this semester to gather together to look at these questions, and I can hardly think of a better guide for this final leg of our journey than our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. Vanessa Wills. Dr. Wills is assistant professor of philosophy at George Washington University. She received her BA in philosophy from Princeton and her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, where she also won a Fulbright to study at the Humboldt University in Berlin, on the way to completing her dissertation entitled Marx and Morality. Dr. Wills has been a visiting faculty fellow at University of Maryland, Baltimore County's Drescher Center for the Humanities, and has held the Dodd Visiting Chair in Ethics and Practice at Ludwig Maximilian Universität's Munich Center for Ethics. Dr. Wills specializes in moral and political philosophy, in 19th century German philosophy, and in the philosophy of race. She's authored numerous articles, including Revolutionary Admiration and What Are You Doing Here? Trayvon Martin and the Logic of Black Guilt. Her articles have examined such topics as the idea that capitalism causes sexism and racism and what we could mean by making that claim, the relationship between racism and false consciousness, and the articulation of a conception of white privilege in relationship to Marxism and critical race theory. Dr. Wills has recently completed her first book, which is due out from Oxford University Press in the coming year, on Marx's moral thought, if I'm getting the title correct.
Marx's ethical vision.
Marx's ethical vision. In addition to her scholarship, however, Dr. Wills is an activist and a public intellectual who regularly comments and writes on matters of race, politics, democracy, and justice. And despite being very early in her career in some ways, she has quickly and already established herself as one of the leading voices in the tradition of Black Marxism today, and one of the most important philosophical interpreters of Marx in her generation. I'm thrilled to welcome her to BU and for our opportunity to learn from and think with her about the relations between Marxism, the university, and the work of moral philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Wills for her lecture, Marxism and the Ends of Moral Philosophy.
That's so kind. Thank you. Thank you. That's so kind, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you, and thank you all of you who came out on a Tuesday evening, cloudy, sort of cool Tuesday evening, to think with me about the end of the university, and especially this task that is taken up in academic settings of moral philosophy in particular, and to think about what it means to do moral philosophy. My talk title, of course, rests on a pun of the ends of moral philosophy, as indeed the entire series does. And I take that pun very seriously. So in the course of my talk, I'm going to speak about what I think the aims and goals of moral philosophizing are, and also talk about a doctrine or let's say a view that that comes up in the thought of Karl Marx in particular, this idea that moral philosophy is itself a kind of historically situated enterprise that arises at a particular moment and that could be completed, right? That there can be such a thing as completing the work of moral philosophy. Here's what's going to happen. I have a whole written out talk that I'm mostly not going to read, actually. Instead, I'm going to extemporate a fair bit and occasionally sort of refer back when I get into things that are very sort of finicky. I want to start actually with something that is personal. And that maybe in each of your lives might resonate in some way. So I last week learned that a friend of mine had suddenly passed. And he was a philosopher. He was somebody who did great work in social philosophy with lots of implications for moral thought. He was roughly my age. Of course, difficult news, right? And it puts me in mind of the ways in which academia has a kind of gloss or halo as a life of the ivory tower, where we come here and we sit in these sit in our comfortable armchairs and just kind of reflect on these abstractions of rarefied theoretical problems. But first maybe for a small handful of people it's like that, and for most people it's not. Whether you're a student, whether you're a faculty member, whether you are support staff, whether you are helping to keep the physical plant clean and safe, right? And whether you're in administration, right? In various ways, we're not we're in an ivory tower, but that ivory tower exists in the world with all of the various pressures of the world. And those pressures come to bear on us in ways that can become matters of life and death in terms of whether we're able to care for ourselves and for one another in ways that are consistent with the work of living and the work of continuing to do this kind of intellectual enterprise that we're engaged in. I think about this myself. I've thought about this for a long time. There's a wonderful philosopher who actually left the academy, and their name is Jennifer Lisa Vest, wrote one of my favorite pieces, which is precisely about the position of Black women and the number of Black women who just sort of die, right? In academics who, due to the stress and the trauma and the just like the incredible struggles that are involved in the work of just getting through life in the university, again, right, a matter of real life and death. And so like that question of why engage in these kinds what look to lots of people in and outside of the university, like really abstract, really kind of niche topics like mine. What does Marx have to say about moral philosophy, right? Lots of people think of as quite a niche topic. Why devote yourself to that kind of work at such potentially great cost, right? And there's no line of work, no profession that's not without similar costs and similar struggles and much heavier ones, right? But why do this? Why devote one's life to these questions that can seem rather fairly removed in some ways from the sort of most pressing matters of daily life? So here's what I want to do in the course of this talk. I want to talk to you a little bit about my reasons for doing it. And I want to connect that to questions about the role of the university and about the role of doing moral philosophy, which is my gig in particular, right, of doing the particular kind of work that I do. And then I want to connect that to getting more into the kind of nitty-gritty of some of my particular work and what I have found and what I have and what questions continue to animate me in my study and my research. And then I want to, once I've sort of taken you through that tour, I want to end by telling you a lot of sort of odd things that I'll defend at the end. Namely, Marx, I argue that Marx sees the struggle of everyday people attempting to survive and to flourish as itself the kind of concrete living answer of the abstractly represented moral questions of philosophy. And I'm going to end by telling you about what that means, especially because the way I just put it, it might sound metaphorical. How can an existing kind of social and political movement be the sort of thing that would be an answer to questions of moral philosophy that sounds like a category mistake? And so I'm going to end by telling you a bit about why I read Marx as being committed to that view, why I think it's the sort of thing that is a reasonable and evocative and enlightening thing to say. And then I'm just going to end, and we're going to have a discussion in Q&A together, right? So the university is lots of things. One of the things it is a place for truth-seeking, right? It is, and not just any kind of truth-seeking, right? Universities are distinct from other kinds of educational organizations precisely in the sense that they seek to bring together as many various disciplines of inquiry as possible and think of them as hanging together as part of one pursuit, right? Now that happens with more or less success. Oftentimes what's happening in one university department is very sort of isolated from what's going on even across the hall, let alone down the street. Universities attempt various ways of addressing this. So if you've ever heard anybody call any initiative interdisciplinary, that is one sort of standby way of kind of reclaiming and calling back the sort of essential task of the university, which is this idea that it's possible to join the individual inquiry of various researchers and students and bring it together somehow into one kind of human pursuit of a better understanding of the world, of our place in it, and and perhaps of how to realize our ends, right? Realize our aims, transform and interact with the world in ways that we find appealing and worthwhile. This vision of the university that I just gave you is one that was very appealing to me as a wee lass, right? Thinking about what I was going to do with my life, right? I was coming out of college, deciding to go to graduate school, and I thought, you know, the university, that's interesting. It seems like I can have a fairly satisfying career and not really hurt anybody. And I had that doe-eyed, fresh-faced conception of university life. I managed to hold on to that for a long time. I was probably 30, which is a little embarrassing, before I realized that I had it all wrong. Because the university is that thing that I just described, but it's also, in practice, another thing, which is a mechanism for transmitting class privilege from one generation to another. And it took me a while to sort of piece that together, right, and think, oh, I was sort of caught up with this one conception of the role of the university that was both very lofty and appealing, also sort of flattering, right, and self-serving. It just turns out that the thing that I find really personally satisfying and interesting also is like very good for humanity. And then I realized actually it's not that simple, right? And there's this important way in which the university, as I mentioned a moment ago, right, is always implicated and wrapped up in these broader dynamics of the society that it's a part of. So, okay, what do we do with that, right? And how does that role, right? How does that fact about the university? The university is also a lab for doing R&D for private enterprise, right? There's all sorts of ways in which the kind of lofty version of the university that I just mentioned exists side by side with these, you might think, less lofty kinds of aims. But anyway, before I figured that out, I got to graduate school, and I started graduate school in 2002. And in 2003, so this was just after 9/11, of course, and in 2003, the second Iraq War broke out. And it's hard from this point now, 20 years later, to really sort of reconstruct what the moral dialogue was, right, at that moment around the war. There was widespread opposition to invading Iraq because it was sort of fairly widely understood, at least among people who thought of themselves as liberals or people who were on the left, that the war was unjustifiable, right? That it was wrong, that it was sort of foolhardy. And I had exactly this conviction. But what I didn't have was an apparatus or a kind of conception of the world that would allow me to understand why it was happening. I was much more politically naive than probably any of the undergrads are here now, right? Largely because I grew up, it was a very different kind of political environment. And, but I couldn't understand, I was like, I don't get it. We live in a democracy. And this war is very unpopular, so why is it happening? And nothing that at the time that I was getting in my education, even as a philosophy grad student at a top program, was very useful to me at that time in making sense of these, the mechanics of this injustice that was occurring. Beyond that, beyond the question of why is this happening, how can this be, this goes against a conception of the world as sort of rationally ordered in some way. I also had a second conviction, right? Aside from the conviction that the war didn't make sense and was undemocratic and et cetera, I also thought it was wrong, right? I thought it was morally wrong. I thought that there was an obvious and just massively scaled injustice being committed against people in Iraq who were being bombed by my country. And again, I just was not finding a kind of moral framework that had been made available to me in my studies that really allowed me to explain or to feel a kind of certainty about this impulse, right, or this kind of intuition that I had. So that set of political problems and the urgency of it, for me, connected my attraction to philosophy, which came about as a result of an attraction to things that were challenging, an attraction to things that I thought I had a talent at, and also to things that I thought somehow would help me make sense of the world. And now we had this sort of massive, explosive, unavoidable kind of rupture, right, with a particular kind of worldview that I had been working with before. So in that time, I got involved in the anti-war movement and met some socialists, right? I think I walked out of a building one day and saw a sign that said, if you have a problem with George Bush, come talk to us. I had a problem with George Bush, so I went and talked to them. And I started to learn about Marx. I had encountered Karl Marx in passing in my undergraduate education, and there I had gotten what was then the sort of very standard approach to Marx, which was, yeah, he had some great ideas, too bad he was wrong, too bad that he was outdated and working with some bad economics. We'll learn about him as a kind of museum curio. But obviously these ideas are quaint relics, right, of the distant past, right? A lot of excited 19th century Germans, but we now know, the tragedy of the Soviet Union, right, now has shown us that these ideas are to be, admired as curios, but certainly not taken seriously. So revisiting Marx, revisiting questions about the relationship between capitalism and power, right? So I had previously had a kind of very ruling class type of education. I'm not, I'm like a black girl from Philly, right? But I got a scholarship and got taught, the sort of official line, right, of how, we live in a democracy and things are as rationally ordered as they possibly could be, and the reason that the United States does the things that it does is because those are the things that reasonable people thinking carefully about these political problems have arrived at as conclusions, and maybe they're wrong, but they're trying their best, right? And finally, the scales fall from my eyes, and I realize, oh, actually, it's all about power, right? It's all about money. And I'm like, oh, this actually explains things much better because it has a kind of predictive, I'm not constantly being caught unawares when things happen that wouldn't happen if the guiding principle for our historical circumstances, what is most rational to do. But if I ask the question, what puts additional money into the pockets of the people who are in a position to make these decisions, turns out that's pretty predictive most of the time, right? So, okay, I have the kind of story of power, of control, of the kind of causal explanation. But what I still was interested in was the moral question, right? I wanted to know, is my outrage, right? Is my revulsion at these crimes taking place, is that a kind of romantic halo, some sort of illusion, right? Or am I tracking a kind of real ethical wrong, like that's occurring, and how do I make sense of that? My interest in reading Marx had helped me to understand more and more of the world, and I'll tell you a little bit about, at this point, about Marxism. Because here is the, well, I'll just give you a kind of gloss, right? Because there's lots of things that people mean when they talk about Marxism. And especially in recent years, there's increasing concern that the university is a hotbed of rabid communists indoctrinating the youth. Spoiler alert, it's not. It really isn't. I know, I would have found them. It's very lonely. What stood out to me were a set of a few things. So Marx's method is, Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels called it the materialist conception of history. And scholars who interpret Marx often refer to it as historical materialism. And historical materialism, for purposes of quick presentation, can be understood as a method of interpreting experience that incorporates two major approaches, and you won't be surprised to hear me say one is material, right? One has to do with matter, this question of matter, and the other one is historical. So lots of philosophy, if you've read, if you think back to like Plato, right, and beyond, lots of philosophy is in some way addressing this question of what is the fundamental substance of being? What is it that our world is made up out of? And one common way of framing that question is reality fundamentally made of matter? Is it the concrete, the physical, that is the most fundamental, fundamentally like determining and constituting aspect of reality? Or are the foundations of reality ideal, conceptual, psychological? Is it concepts that do the most work to determine what kinds of social systems we have and what kinds of relationships we have with one another and what our material circumstances look like, right? And that debate occurs in a number of different domains. Marx argued that reality was fundamentally material, but that's not to say that ideas are somehow unreal or non-determining. For Marx, the idea is that you have the sort of material relationships or material features of existence that themselves set the parameters for what kinds of ideas you can expect to find in a set of circumstances that have a particular material character. And the ideas in turn, right, and the work of doing intellectual inquiry and of arguing with one another and of developing theories of the world, that in turn, right, can move us to operate on our material circumstances in ways that then transform the material circumstances, transform us, who are in important ways shaped by our material circumstances, and then put us in a position to think new ideas that are made possible by these transformed material circumstances. And so that also incorporates the historical nature, right, of reality for Marx. The idea that if you want to understand anything about being with a capital B scientifically, you have to understand it in motion. You have to think about how the things that we interact with in the world transform over time. You have to see them in their dynamic and processual transformation over time. And if you try to take a kind of snapshot of the world at any given moment, you're likely to end up with an understanding of the world that is misled. And because the way something appears in that snapshot can tend to obscure the way that the thing might appear if you were able to see it in motion, right? And I can say more about this in Q&A and get into, get into more how this applies. But this was really useful to me, right? In thinking about the kind of the way that the events of the early 2000s at this point, which is like ancient history to many of you, but how the events of this period couldn't be understood just looking at the New York Times, right, and reading an article. I had to think more historically in a way that I hadn't before, and in a way that doesn't always happen in philosophy in particular, right, where we think about how the ideas are actually situated in particular circumstances, how they arise out of particular political exigencies, right, and particular kind of social conflicts, and how understanding that historical situatedness and the way that various theories and ideas are implemented in time, right, and the kinds of effects that they have when they're applied, right, historically, how that then might reveal something about the content of the ideas and the concepts themselves, like the concept of democracy, for example, right, that I was quickly finding out was not what I thought it was, right? And the way I figured that out was just by seeing it, seeing how it actually played out concretely. So it both offered a kind of framework for addressing some of the questions that had come up for me in my philosophy classes, and even more tantalizingly, right, offered this way to think about these things that were happening in the world, right, so that I wasn't just constantly kind of like, well, that's a bad thing and that's a bad thing, right? Instead, I was able to think about these things as all hanging together, right, as part of one system with a kind of internal development that could be studied and understood, so that I was able to better understand what might be coming next, and to better think about what I could do and how I could intervene, right, in that whole kind of set of circumstances. So I want to talk to you about, let me see, I think I'm doing pretty good for time. Let's see. Oh, great. So I want to talk to you about my book, because that is the sort of a kind of culmination in a way, right, of a lot of that thought. So my book is called Marx's Ethical Vision. The questions of the book began as questions that I ended up addressing in my dissertation when I was in graduate school. And the thing I wanted to know is, what does that materialist conception of history that I just glossed for you, that is a conception of history that claims to be able to make sense of all aspects of social being, right? That claims to be a method that speaks directly to that principal aim of the university, right, that I began with, right, this idea that all these various lines of inquiry and kind of disciplinary research can be brought together, right, as one human pursuit. So if that's true, right, then you would expect it to have something to say about morality, right, to have something to say in response to the concerns of moral philosophy. And I wondered, well, what does Marx say about these things? The answers that I got were not satisfying, which was frustrating, but also meant, aha, dissertation topic, great. And I'll tell you a little bit about why this question of what can a Marxist historical materialist perspective contribute to our understanding of moral philosophy. I'm going to lay out for you why that stands out as a kind of particularly difficult question for a Marxist perspective, and how it relates to the ways that philosophers in the Anglophone Academy in particular have read Marx, or more usually not read Marx, right? So I just told you this story about how thinking about the world according to this model that Marx gives allowed me to make sense of the world, and in particular, I was less surprised all the time, right? I wasn't in that sort of stunned liberal, like, I don't get it, this seems so bad, how could this happen? I was like, yeah, it's happening because blah, 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 right? Here are the things. But there's a kind of tension there, right? Precisely the aspects of the world that Marxism points to ground its offer of a theory with predictive power, right? Of a theory that's going to help you understand why, given these conditions, that is the thing that was going to happen. That kind of claim about the law-likeness of history and the scientificity of historical materialism as a method for understanding history runs afoul of some philosophical tensions that will be very familiar, right, to anyone in this room who's taken a kind of introductory philosophy class, right? Namely, you have a very classic problem of freedom and determinism, right? So on the one hand, Marxism is saying, history is not random, right? And history also is not just primarily moved by the ideal aspects of being. And things like the will are going to be ideal, right? Are going to be psychological. So you have a view that's saying it's not the psychological, right, aspects of being, like, for example, the values you hold, or the beliefs in your head, or the content of your will that plays the most determining role in shaping the flow of history. It is the material things, right? The concrete, the physical, the objective, right? Things that exist independently of any of our thoughts about them. And that sounds a lot like the kind of classic picture of determinism that, again, you know, in that sort of intro philosophy class, right, you learn, oh, there's this problem, right? When we think about morality, we are most typically thinking about a kind of practice of praising and blaming that only makes sense if we think that the objects of that kind of moral judgment are themselves free, right? If they have free wills that are not just determined from the outside, right? If it makes sense somehow to think of you, right, as the true author of your act, only then does it make sense to morally blame you or praise you for it. And if Marxism is committed to a version of determinism that would rule out the possibility of the kind of freedom that we think moral judgment depends upon, then it's going to look like Marx's theory is the kind of thing that just can't admit of moral philosophy at all, right? And that is, it turns out, a very common reading of Marx and a very common way of thinking about the relationship of Marxist ideas to the central concerns of moral philosophy. I think so I argue that there's a couple ways in which this goes wrong, right, and kind of gets things or depicts the case in a way that is confused. So one of them is, first of all, in thinking about what is moral philosophy, and is the main task of moral philosophy to issue moral praise and blame, right? To sort of identify individuals and mark them out for particular kinds of judgment. That is one particular kind of conception of moral philosophy that is widespread in the academy, but it historically is by no means hegemonic. And what Marx, the tradition that Marx is working within is more of an Aristotelian kind of tradition. And what I mean by that is Marx is working from a conception of human nature, right, of what it is to be a human being. And he thinks that if you can get clear on what it is to be a human being, that there's various kinds of normative upshot that are to be derived from that. So this runs into another kind of familiar problem, which is that, wow, it really sounds like you just said that you can derive an is about what human nature is, that you can derive an ought about what human beings ought to do from an is, right, about what human beings are. And yes, I did say that because it's true. And what is distinctive in Marx is the notion that the is of human nature already contains within it an aim, right? Already contains within it a kind of already existing aspiration that is itself the product of human beings' attempts to survive the world. He thinks that if you look historically at the ways that human beings in all sorts of places at all sorts of times have attempted to satisfy their needs, and needs are construed very broadly here, right? So needs are everything from needing to eat to needing to express yourself through music and pick up a guitar and play a song, right? And Marx thinks if you look at how it is that human beings interact with their natural and social environment to satisfy their needs, that in that you find an engagement in that ongoing interaction between matter and ideas that I mentioned before, namely compelled by hunger or cold or heat, right? They grab an apple, or they get into a cave, or right, they take a dip in a pool. And in that process, they also change their own relationship to the natural world. They might also even change the natural world itself, as when societies move from hunter-gatherer models to more agrarian models to an industrialized form of production and so on, right? And the idea for Marx is that always in this sort of development and increasing complexity of human existence, you have present in it various ways in which human beings are attempting to both survive, satisfy their subsistence needs, and also express themselves in and through the world and their relationships with the natural world and with one another. And human beings, Marx argues, develop more and more needs, right? The more they produce, the more they need. And Marx thinks that's a good thing, because as their needs proliferate, so does their individuality, their distinctness, the broadening array of ways that human beings can create, can make art, can have social interactions, right? Marx at some points calls this a kind of transformation from man as a herd animal, right? Like the sort of very, imagine like fresh off whatever's like the one right before Homo sapiens to Homo sapien, right? The sort of the human being who's just like most immersed and most identical with its strictly biological needs, to what he refers to in Capital as the rich individual. And the rich individual for Marx is an individual who is engaged in this like constantly dynamically unfolding array of forms of interaction and creation and production and existence, and who also regards that very process itself as one that is worth pursuing, right, and worth creating the conditions for. So Marx argues that human nature, right, which for him is the labor process, and the labor process, again, understood in this broad way that I'm suggesting, right, that the labor process contains all of human beings' interaction with their natural and social worlds in order to realize their aims, right? And Marx thinks that process that is already unfolding, that is the one we want to look to in order to explain why it is that human beings are as they are, and what kind of brings all these various forms of human life together and makes them sensible as one ongoing dynamic process. That is, it's an is, right, that contains within it an aim, an end, a direction, right? And the argument for communism, right, where communism is understood as this shared control over socially necessary resources so that people have access to the things that are necessary in order for them to pursue their individual and social development in that way, that is recommended, right? The ought of communism is already implicit in the is of human striving for survival, right, in the already existing society that we are trying to survive, right? So I think I probably have about 5 minutes. Is that about right? Like, because I want to make sure there's time for discussion. 8 minutes, great. Okay, cool. So that's perfect. I'm going to do two things in those 8 minutes. And the one is to talk about some more, I guess, of the challenges of doing Marxist inquiry in the university space, right? And then I'm going to close by speaking to that sort of peculiar claim that I made earlier, which is that for Marx, the working class itself is the answer to moral problems. And I promised you that I was going to flesh that out in a way that doesn't just sort of take a cop out of making it kind of metaphorical. There's, yeah, as you can imagine, there's lots of challenges in making Marx like safe somehow in academic spaces. And I think they're especially prominent when you're doing moral philosophy. And here's why. It's because there is a strong temptation to overshoot the project of inquiring into the normative aspects of Marxist theory. And by that I mean you can answer the question, does Marx have a moral content? And then you can overshoot it and basically defang Marx so that he's just a source of various kinds of completely toothless moral injunctions, right? And I think that's a very real temptation because it's a temptation that divorces Marx's normative resources from the living movement that he's observing and attempting to interpret, namely working class movements, right? He's looking at working people in industrialized and industrializing economic systems and thinking about what it is that is aspired to in their struggles and what would have to be the case in order for the aspired to vision of their struggles to be a realized historical fact. And it can be very tempting to say, well, you know, what's with all that class struggle stuff? Can't we just get to the moral claims about the goodness of everybody having access to the resources that they need in order to live well? And we can talk more about it in Q&A. What I'm going to say briefly for now is that if you do that, you end up with a Marx that is not in any way different from the views of philosophers that he was in opposition to. The moral philosopher that he, at least in print, probably expressed the most respect for was John Stuart Mill. Marx had really important critiques of utilitarianism, but when it came to Mill, he was happy to say, well, look, John Stuart Mill has the right idea about what it is what a sort of future better world would look like. What Mill gets wrong, Marx thought, was that Mill thinks that result is one that can be arrived at through the activity of the will, that we can have the existing method, the existing relations of production, ones that concentrate power into the hands of a very small economic elite, and somehow, with the right kind of moral philosophy, still end at a result that puts necessary resources into the hands of everyone and gives them democratic control over it. And so Marx's critique is precisely that if you start with these relations of production, you end with those relations of distribution, and you can't divorce the two. And so therefore, if you try to sort of like take the seemingly ethical claims of Marx about what would be desirable, you divorce them from what is actually distinctive about Marx, which is a theory about how to make those desirable conditions actual, right? But it's tempting, and lots of folks do it. It's tempting because you get into less trouble that way, right? And then I'll end with my point about the working class, especially that's perfect because it segues nicely from there. Another aspect of Marxist thought that leads people to think that there's nothing in Marxist theory that offers anything useful to people doing moral philosophy is the fact that Marx says things that but they're very readily interpreted as implying that moral philosophy is itself a kind of symptom of class society, right? And then the step from there is to think, oh, well, Marx thinks that moral philosophizing is a symptom of class society. Therefore, he thinks that when we do moral philosophy, we're just engaging in something that is either illusory or necessarily such as to re-entrench the existing relations of class society. I don't think either of those things, and I argue that we still live in a class society, right? And so therefore, the questions that moral philosophy raises, how ought we to treat one another? What should our social world look like, right? What does it mean to live a good life? All those questions are live for us. We don't know. We live in a world that makes it very confusing and mysterious most of the time what the answers to those questions could be. So I don't think that Marx is suggesting that the concerns of moral philosophy are themselves sort of misleading or such as to take us down the primrose path. But what is misleading is to think that the answer is going to come from more philosophizing, right? Philosophy can help us to put the question as clearly as possible, right? It can help us to understand the implications of some of the various contenders as answers to those questions. But ultimately, if you want to know the answer to the question, how ought human beings to live? What is it for human beings to live in harmony with one another? What is it for human beings to exist in accordance with their nature, to put it in those Aristotelian terms that I raised? The only way to know is to actually achieve the aims of human emancipation, right? Is to actually take away, right, the alienating and stultifying conditions within which human beings live and produce ones where we can actually see, right, how it is that human beings interact with one another when they are able to express their own productive and creative powers in conditions that are mutually conducive with the flourishing of one another. And that is the kind of thing that we can't answer by representing it abstractly in theory. It's the kind of thing we can only answer by taking up the aims of a movement that has precisely that goal in sight, and that is the goal of workers' liberation, which for Marx is identical with the project of human emancipation, and which is why we hear Marx saying that human history hasn't begun yet, right? And the aim is to create those conditions in which it could actually come to be. So that's it. Thank you, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wills, for a terrific lecture and for the way of melding your intellectual reflection with a little bit about your story and bringing those together. So we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Willis. This is a question that I've been kind of struggling with for maybe a little over a year now, as I've grown a little frustrated with liberalism's effeteness for social change. And I guess I'm still trying to formulate it somewhat, but it's as to whether as we go on in under neoliberalism and the fracturing of identities into lots of different identities, and that's an important thing. But when paired with liberal elites' understanding of language and sort of policing of language, those two things together, is that do you find that fractious to class solidarity, or I don't know. It almost seems like insidious to me in a way, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is a central concern of my work, because I very much am committed to the view, I'm class analysis all the way, and I've written about, I'll start with this. So I've written, one piece that I wrote is called "What Could It Mean to Say Capitalism Causes Sexism and Racism?" Because that is one of those claims that people hear Marxists say and they think, oh my gosh, you guys, because it sounds as though it is necessarily committed to dismissing or devaluing the importance of various kinds of identity-based oppressions. And what I argue in that paper, so one of the things I argue is, so I wrote that paper motivated by two things: irritation and time management. Because I found that when I wrote about identity, I was constantly trying to re-explain this. And I was like, wouldn't it be great if I just had a paper out there where I could say, see my, And the irritation came from many things. One of them is philosophers in particular have really sophisticated, nuanced, and robust ways of thinking about causation. But when it comes to trying to understand what it would mean to say that the economic and material conditions of existence play an outsized, fundamentally determining role in shaping the ideological aspects of existence, all of a sudden, many sort of critical interpreters of Marx interpret that phrase as though the only kind of causation that Marxism could have recourse to is some kind of epiphenomenalism, where the material affects the ideal, and the ideal is just kind of like unreal and immaterial and doesn't matter. But of course, that needn't be the case, right? But are issues of identity a distraction? I think sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. I think that there are lots of examples of cases where some position of power is occupied by a person who has a marginalized identity, and that is then seen as a win, a kind of blow against the oppression of people with that identity. And I think that that's usually a bait and switch and sleight of hand, right? And that focusing overly much on that, right, the sort of occupation of elite spaces by people with marginalized identities, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I don't think it is, but it can be quite a distraction and quite an effective way of sort of gutting movements that are struggling for the real emancipation of people with those marginalized identities. On the other hand, I think that there is another kind of mistake that is easy to make by Marxists or anybody who has a kind of like class-based analysis way of thinking about these things, which is to dismiss, right, those kinds of struggles entirely and try to subordinate them in some way to a class struggle when, of course, working class people have identities. So very right. We can separate these things abstractly, but in practice, if you're not liberating queer people and people of color and women and all, then you're not liberating people. I don't know. That's maybe unsatisfying because my answer is yes and no. Yeah, but those are some of the things I think, to navigate there. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm a freshman, and I haven't took any philosophy courses yet.
Yeah.
So it's my.
I like the yet. Yeah.
Yeah, but I am considering to have a minor or something like that, and I joined. Yeah. So I'm very curious about the relationship between materialistic foundation proposed by Marx and also our human will and ideology. Because when I listened to your lecture, I found it's more like a mutual relationship, right? Like we are influenced by materialistic foundation rather than some Platonic stuffs, like form of ideas that fancy stuff, this material stuff influence our thoughts, and our thoughts then also mutually influence our construction of material world.
Yes.
So could you say more about this mutual relationship? And because I'm also taking a religion class, and I know like Marx is his attitude for religion is relatively negative. So I'm just wondering that mutual relationship, how does it associate with religion?
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. Yes, so the way that you described the mutuality of material and ideal factors, I think is spot on. And then the thing that I would add to it, right, is that for Marx, one of these sides is that the two things impact one another, but material aspects of existence have an additional character, which is that they condition the interaction between matter and ideas. So you have a relationship between the material circumstances and our ideas about them, but then also the kind of path and shape that interaction takes is also itself determined by the material circumstances in a way that it's not similarly determined by the ideal circumstances. So let me give you an example of that. Marx thinks that labor, which he sometimes calls the activity of human self-changing, he thinks that is the essential human activity. He thinks if you want to make sense of human existence as this dynamic unfolding process through history, the thing you want to be looking at is how are human beings interacting with their circumstances in order to satisfy their needs, broadly understood. And he thinks that insight is an insight that is made possible by the conditions of capitalism. He thinks it's the way that capitalism creates a class, a group of people who are themselves defined by their activity of labor. He thinks that is a necessary material precondition for being able to have the insight that he's having, namely, this thing of labor is a universal category through which we can understand all of human existence. And he contrasts that, for example, actually with Aristotle. He thinks that because Aristotle lived at a time in a society where labor was the work of was associated with the enslaved, right, and a kind of exclusion from humanity, that this was not an insight that would have been available to Aristotle in the same way. And so you have this notion of an idea that's made possible by a certain kind of set of economic and material and historical conditions that have created this moment in which that truth can be theorized. Now that it's theorized, Marx thinks, you can then use that idea both to understand things about human life that might have been obscure before, and maybe to help guide a revolution, right, and see the importance, right, of emancipating this activity of labor from its appearance, which is Marx writes that labor appears under capitalism as a kind of denial of human life, right, as this kind of like odious and stultifying thing that some human beings are relegated to. And what remains to be done is to have conditions that allow labor to be more readily seen to be, in fact, the central human activity, right? And to actually have that kind of character. So that's one kind of example of this idea that like yes, the ideas are important, they're of like tremendous importance, but there's certain ideas that are only theorizable under certain material circumstances, and then once you have the idea, now guided by that idea, you might then be able to intervene into the material conditions themselves to produce a new set of material conditions.
So that historical and political movements, like their foundations are actually material-based, right?
Yes, yeah. So always when this another example of this comes with his critiques of certain other moral theories. So so Jeremy Bentham, who is a utilitarian, is one author that is sort of picked out for particular abuse, by Marx, and he calls him that leather-tongued oracle of the bourgeoisie, right? And Marx's criticism is you have this moral theory that presents itself as something that is universal, but actually what Bentham is doing in Marx's view is just sort of systematizing the very specific, particular, limited worldview of, in Marx's view, a 19th century shopkeeper, right? And so oftentimes in his kind of ideology critique of various theories, that's precisely what he's doing, is he's saying this theory is determined and shaped by these particular economic and political conditions in ways that the people who theorized the theories were themselves not even aware of, and that therefore, that lack of awareness itself allowed them to think that these views were universally valid for all human beings, when in fact they weren't. They were bound by space and time. And then you asked another question about, I know I'm going on, but I do want to answer the question about religion, because it's really important, and it's actually in here, the written version of the talk. So this question about how does Marx think about religion is, I think, of central importance. It's so, after I already was thinking of myself as a Marx scholar, and I'm like, I really know a lot about Karl. I was asked to write a piece for an edited volume about atheism, and I was like, okay. I was excited to do it for lots of reasons. One of which is that Marx says really odd things about his relationship to atheism. Namely, he says on numerous occasions that he's not an atheist. Yes, that face exactly, right? And he's not really agnostic either. And right, exactly. Yeah. So I was like, why does he say this really peculiar seeming thing? And he says on several occasions. One of the places that he's most clear about this is in a letter that he writes, where he says that he's tired of the atheists because the atheists go around and they sound like children, telling anybody who'll listen that they're not afraid of the boogeyman. And so he's just like, you sound ridiculous, right? He's like, I'm not an atheist. And so I wanted to know, like, why does he say this? Marx thinks of atheism as an answer to a question. And the question, of course, is, does God exist, right? Is God real? And Marx thinks the problem is not in the answer you give to the question. The problem is in asking the question. He thinks asking the question itself is already a sign of an alienated way of relating to being with a capital B. And that's going to count for agnosticism as well, right? If you say, well, I have a question but no answer, you're not any better off because the problem is the question. And so in my view, this is because Marx thinks that, so one way that I find helpful to think about Marx is as an author who is standing within or maybe just outside of a kind of German idealist tradition. And one of the central preoccupations of that tradition is the question, what makes science possible if it's possible, right? What is it that makes it possible for us to have objective, universally valid knowledge of the world? And for Marx, the answer is, surprise, labor, right? And labor specifically as this kind of like practical interaction between ourselves and our surroundings, our environments, that then is part of this historical process where we are transforming the thing and transforming ourselves. And he thinks that God, insofar as God is supposed to be this being that exists completely externally to human intervention, that existed before we did, right? That is something that has a kind of independent existence separate from us. He thinks this is just the kind of thing that you, in principle, couldn't know about through the only method that he recognizes anyway as a method to know the world, which is namely through transforming our human relationship with it so that we are engaged in this relationship of material transformation and interaction. And so the sort of idea of God, the notion of God, Marx thinks is just the kind of thing that you couldn't know anything about in principle. And so he, what I call it a kind of radical irreligion for Marx. And what's also interesting about this is I think oftentimes Marx is seen as being, like you mentioned, like he's negative about religion. Marx, I think, is actually like quite nuanced about religion. So there's that famous line about religion being the opiate of the people, but he also calls it the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart in a heartless world, and even the opium of the people line, like if any of you have had surgery, you want opiates. That's what you want, and so even that is not really is meant to be nuanced. Right, even that line is meant in its full nuance, right? Something that he thinks both kinds of creates a fog between human beings and reality, but also makes reality bearable. And he ends that long passage by saying that, and this is another of his critiques of the atheists. He says that the role of criticism is not to pluck the flower from the chain and just leave the chain, right? The role of criticism is to unveil and realize the charm, right, of a world that can seem charmless, right? And so he thinks that there's a kind of aspiration in religion that if your version of atheism is one that sees that aspiration as itself not worth pursuing, Marx thinks, yeah, you're wrong, right? Insofar as religion it sort of contains this aspiration to be in touch with the charm, right, of existence. Marx thinks that we want to keep that. So anyway, just a very kind of like nuanced way of thinking about religion and its aims. Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm a big
Hi.
fan of your work.
Thank you.
I have two questions about teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Which kind of, I think, connect like the very beginning of your talk to the
Yeah.
end, and they're things that I struggle with. So I think they're connected to each other, but you might have to explain how they're connected to each other. So like the first one is I often struggle with like still really wanting to hold on to sort of like my classroom as like a sort of democratic ideal kind
Yeah.
of place, and like, you know, you can like think about that as an act of resistance if you want, but like it doesn't it's not I don't think it like fits in with this picture of things in like a comfortable way. And so I often just think about like what I'm really doing when I'm teaching,
Yeah.
especially like introduction to philosophy.
Yeah.
And then relatedly, like I really struggle with how to teach moral philosophy. And I basically just don't teach like moral theories in my, I don't teach like utilitarianism and stuff like that in my intro class. And part of why is like I worry that there's some kind of like tension with the democratic ideal thing I'm trying to achieve, and then like the way in which not just Marxist but also other kinds of critiques of what's going on with like Anglophone moral philosophy, I think often seem really like totalizing to students, and I mean I think they are. That's
Right.
why, right?
Yeah.
And so I really struggle with like what to do about that,
Yeah.
because part of me wants to be like, here students, just like look at the world in front of you and look at all of these different ways that you can think about things,
Yeah.
and that sort of goes with the like democratic ideal thing. But then if I try to actually teach it, it's like I worry that either I'm doing too much like indoctrination accidentally or something, or I worry that like, I don't know. I just help me. What do you do since we're talking about the end of the universe?
Yeah. Thank you. I was actually just reflecting on this just earlier this afternoon, because I think the case in my own teaching career where the concerns that you raise appeared most acutely was a set of experiences I had teaching philosophy of race. And this was maybe about a decade ago now. And because my default is exactly that, like, hey, we're all just a bunch of inquirers, like having a time, and except one of us gives the others grades, but otherwise, and that mostly works, right? For lots of topics, that works pretty well. I had this experience teaching a philosophy of race class, and it did not work. It was horrible. And I can laugh now, but it was like traumatizing in all the ways that you can imagine. And I got to the end of the class, And I was just like, I think I made them all more racist than they were when they got there, and I thought about like, how could I not do that again? Um, and I realized that particular format of like, hey, we all just have ideas and they're all super valid, was completely counter to creating a productive pedagogical space. Because it turns out that if you just ask a room of folks who haven't already been actively engaged in the work of thinking critically about these questions, we live in a racist society, so the received sort of pre-theoretical things that people think are mostly really racist. And if you treat the space as like, oh, we all have really valid, we don't, actually. So that was like one thing that was wrong with it. The other thing was this particular educational space, I think I was like the only Black person in the room. And so I had this like persona of like, here I am, your objective teacher who's just, doesn't have any preconceived notions. They're not dumb, right? They can see, they're looking right at me, and they can make some reasonably accurate guesses, right, about what I think. And so then that posture just comes off like I'm lying, which I was, and so it just didn't help. It didn't make anybody feel any more comfortable. It didn't make anyone actually feel any more free to say what they really thought, because I'm leading with like a lie, basically, it didn't. And then the other thing that I think happens in a lot of pedagogy and philosophical pedagogy in particular is this like life of the mind thing, right? Where it's like, we're all just like free, rational inquirers, but people have feelings, right? And when especially like, oftentimes, I'm going to speak like universally, but like, for students who haven't thought about these things before, especially you have the emotions of students who come from marginalized racial backgrounds, and you have the emotions of white students who are like worried about saying the wrong thing or are feeling confronted by the material. And the way I was teaching it didn't make room for any of that, didn't have any space to acknowledge that any of those feelings were happening. And I didn't even make space for my feelings, because I was being damaged in that classroom. Like, I came out, I was just like, and I had to teach it again the next semester. And I was just like, yeah, that cannot happen again. And so some things that I did was, I think one of the largest things was dropping the like overall just like free, objective, rational inquirer act, which gave like undue support to like just unreflective, racist like opinions, right? And B, which sort of like silenced people, everyone in the room, from whatever perspective they were coming at, in terms of the like real like kind of emotional drama that was happening internally for everybody, and then was coming out in bad ways. And one of the things I did I remember on the first day of class, I instead of like, I'm your objective, unflappable professor, I was like, yeah, so here's what's going to happen this semester. We're talking about race, and some of you are going to say things that are going to make me want to go over there and bang my head against the wall. But it's cool. It's fine. We're going to get through it. And like, even just saying that, like, instead of pretending I wasn't going to have an emotional response, which was like unhealthy for me and an obvious lie for them. And then they just had to guess at what kind of emotional response I was going to have and wonder if it was going to impact their grade or make me think less of them. It was so much better for me to say, like, yeah, you're going to say stuff that's going to piss me off. I'm a grown-up. We'll get through, we'll get past that. And it just was like, there were other things I did that just made it like a much better class. But I also dropped the like, oh, all these different perspectives are just equally valid. They're not. They're not. If you've never thought about this before and you're just kind of like unreflectively parroting the like dominant views, that's not equally valid, right? You can express it, but we can talk about like which views are better grounded in history and reason. And they don't have to agree. It doesn't have to be my views, right? But just challenging students to do that. So yeah, anyway, that's just like a set of experiences I had that I think kind of address like some of these questions of how do you navigate wanting to lead, right, intellectually, while also providing space for people to express themselves and feel comfortable and like that it's okay to have a range of views in the classroom, and a way to do that like in a authentic way versus I think what's really a kind of inauthentic way that it isn't helpful for anybody.
Thank you. Also, I have to leave.
Okay, yeah. And with that, I'm out of here.
Hi, my name is Cynthia. I'm a graduate student at the School of Theology, and I'm thinking about just hopefully a fun, curious question.
Yeah.
If Karl Marx were alive today, what do you think he would say to some of the movements that are taking place, like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
and then also thinking about with these movements and protests, like, would you consider that to be an act of labor that actually contributes to capitalism?
Oh, interesting. So I think, so to take the two examples you gave, sorry, you guys are quite loud up here. So to give answers to the examples that you gave, which were Occupy and Black Lives Matter, I think that he would give different, as you might guess, give different kinds of answers. So I have what is now a kind of like familiar kind of Marxist critique of Occupy, which is, the other side has leaders, right? The other side is organized. They know who's in charge. They have a whole, and so I really think that if any movement that wants to meaningfully advance its own cause and its own interest and make itself heard has to have some kind of structure that allows it to be effective in directing and organizing the various forces of the people that are in it, right? And I think there's of course space for spontaneity, but that has to exist with some kind of method for making the aspirations that are expressed spontaneously into a political program that can actually realize them. And I think Marx would say essentially the same type of thing. Black Lives Matter, especially the protest, the sort of resurgence of protest activity of spring 2020, I think is a really interesting example, because one of the things that people talk less about is what was happening leading up to that resurgence of activity. And I think it's often characterized as a spontaneous response to the state murder of George Floyd. But okay, of course there was spontaneity in that response, but in the months leading up to that, you had the largest uptick in labor activism in the United States in decades. You had an incredible number of wildcat strikes happening across the country. You had the Instacart, there was a workers at Instacart struck. You had all kinds of organized labor actions in protest of people being told that they were essential labor and therefore had to continue to sacrifice their lives for the economy. And that labor activism oftentimes led, not often, very often led by Black and brown people, is what created some of the existing infrastructure for people to get out onto the streets and be organized in the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think, ultimately, much of the failure of the protest, one, not enough organization, right? We have a left that is mostly very disorganized, right? And after decades of being battered in various ways. So there was we needed more organization, right? And then you also had the presidential election that year, which I would argue kind of co-opted some of the energy of that movement and said, well, look, we're going to have a Black VP. Isn't that kind of the same thing as, liberating Black people? And a lot of energy and momentum ended up going into that. And I think it speaks to the bankruptcy of subordinating the aspirations of working class people to the electoral aims of a bourgeois political party. Marx also, and I'll just mention this because it's relevant here, Marx had, there's a kind of, this is not in your question, but broadly speaking, there's a kind of truism. Oh, well, Marx didn't talk about race. Marx didn't talk about, which isn't true, actually. So there's examples of Marx writing open letters to Abraham Lincoln and to the American white working class in the American Civil War, and explaining why it was so important to end the enslavement of people of African descent in the United States, and why this actually goes to the question of identity as well, right? Why this was an absolute political necessity, right, and moral necessity, he wouldn't have put in those terms, in order to achieve the aim of emancipating workers of all types, right, and of creating human emancipation. So he thought that struggle was absolutely central to his concerns. Yeah.
I'm going to let myself ask a question. Could you say a little bit more to fill out the Marxist anthropology as you see it, in this respect in particular? So in your presentation, there was a focus on two primary human needs. First, these sort of material needs, and then secondly, kind of expressive needs.
Yeah.
And what I wondered was where wonder fits in there, and or the need to contemplate, that is, knowledge of knowing the true and finding joy in it. And in particular, some of these students have been reading a book by Zena Hitz that you may know, Lost in Thought. And that book is shot through with story after story of people who, in the midst of radical deprivation, including being in concentration camps, nonetheless find a kind of happiness in contemplation, that is, in knowing what is true, not necessarily in some kind of religious way. And obviously, Hitz would think, well, it would certainly be better for them not to be under those material deprivations. But she would also say that wonder and that desire to contemplate speaks to something true about who human beings are, and then seems to suggest something about what would constitute the fulfillment of human nature that seems more than or other than or not reducible to either satisfaction of abundance of material goods or expressiveness. So where does that fit in a Marxist picture?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so another way of thinking about what it means to speak of labor, the labor process, or this process of human self-changing as identical with human nature, is also to think of all of the various appearances of human nature as being the result, the consequence of human beings engaging in that process. So if if I were to give, which I won't in the time that we have, but if I were to give a kind of historical materialist account, right, of wonder, I would be asking, okay, well, what is it about the activity of, I would ground it in that activity of satisfying our needs and satisfying subsistence needs, but that doesn't mean that it's reducible to that process. What I would give is a story about how the emergence of wonder as a way that human beings relate intellectually to the world around them is itself a product of human beings' ongoing interaction and engagement with the world, one that bottoms out in the practice of keeping themselves alive, because if they're not alive as biological beings, then they're not alive as wondering beings, but that doesn't reduce it to that process. Another way to put it, and I didn't put it this way in the talk, and so this question lets me add this, layer this onto the story. In all my work, I start from the working premise that human existence is a human product, which is the sort of thing that can sound sort of almost pat, but it means that methodologically, I'm always asking, how is it that this aspect of human existence is something that human beings themselves have made and produced in the course of history, right? And so that's what it would look like to then tell a historical materialist account of wonder. Yeah.
Time for one last question.
Thank you, Dr. Wills. I wanted to ask, kind of as a follow-up to your conclusion, if you thought there's anything that, I don't know, particular that moral philosophy might have to offer working class struggle for working class people in the practice, and if there's anything generalizable from that to other disciplines for those of us who are not in moral philosophy. Thank you.
Yeah. I may not get to the second question, but for the first, yes, I think this is gonna, I don't know, maybe it'll sound kind of mushy, but I think one important thing it has to offer is encouragement. In the preface to my book, I end the preface by sort of speaking directly to people who think there's really something wrong. that the fact that people live in deprivation, that we have and reproduce the domination of some people over others, that so much human potential is squandered, that if you think that that's not right, and nonetheless live in a world that tells us at every turn that it is right, whether it outright says, oh no, the domination of the quote-unquote strong over the quote-unquote weak is a good thing, right? Or whether it sort of soft pedals it and says, oh, well, maybe it's not that good, but it's the best we can do, all right? And there's no alternative to this. If you think, no, actually we should fight for something else, and if it encourages your fighting spirit to know that you're right about that, here's a book, right? That really kind of like gives a robust, the thing, like I wrote the book that I wished like existed when I was looking for it, right? The thing that really like explains like, no, like you're not, crazy, right? To think that something is deeply wrong and that the way that we are forced to live and do live as human beings is not the way that we should be living, right? So there's that, and then there's also, beyond encouragement, there is the fact that a big part of the reason that I was drawn to this question of what are the normative resources offered by Marx is that I thought, here's a theory and a method that claims to be able to give a holistic picture of human existence. And if that's right, then its sort of claims to scientificity should also extend to these common concerns about how should we live, what should we do, what's next, right? And if they don't, then I thought, Marx's theory would be limited and diminished in exactly the ways that its critics think that it is, right? When they say, oh, this doesn't have any room for human freedom, and this doesn't have any room for thinking about the world in a way that isn't just kind of mechanistic. And so for me, it's also a test, right? Does this theory actually give us the resources to think about human life in a full, robust, and thorough way, including the questions that most of us look to theory to answer? And if it turns out theory is silent on those questions, it better have a good story about that as well, right? And so I think one of the things that moral philosophy done in this, with this Marxist perspective allows us to do is to also have a more kind of complete perspective on whether the theory of Marxism is itself any good. And lives up to its own promises. And that in turn is useful for thinking through its various recommendations about what is called for, what is necessary, what kinds of activities are going to allow us to realize the things that so far only exist as moral aspirations.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Wills.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for your attendance at the lecture series over the course of the fall. We'll have some more events in the spring. Thank you again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your questions. Thank you.